And now I would like to introduce our next speaker, who is joining us from another continent, and he will give us an insight about his recent study on what to expect from global quantum computing market. Please welcome Bob Sorensen. He's a Senior Vice President of Research and Chief Analyst of Quantum Computing in Hyperion Research. Bob has an extensive expertise in the field of advanced computing and in assessing disruptive and emerging technologies in the IT sector. And before joining Hyperion Research, Bob worked for over 30 years in the US federal government as a senior science and technology analyst. Bob, glad to see you back, returning to Quantum Summit with your new findings. The stage is yours.
Great, thank you very much. And I'm glad to be back, and hopefully at some point I'll be back in person. That would be nice. But we'll do the best we can. So thanks again for the invitation. As I said, I promised a whirlwind tour of what's going on in quantum, so we're going to jump right into this as soon as possible. I will present an email, my email at the end of this, and if there are any questions or follow-ups, as I said, this is going to be a quick run-through. I have to admit, I'm really pleased that I followed Jan from IQM because we share the same vision in terms of how quantum computing ultimately becomes an additional tool in the arsenal of advanced computing. I will tell you the Hyperion Research is an advanced computing consulting firm. We look at all examples of computing that can bring additional computational capabilities to important workloads centering in the science and engineering categories. And so the idea that quantum computing is ultimately something that the HPC world will adopt the same way they adopted GPUs or high bandwidth memory or FPGAs as a way to accelerate critical applications is the essence of how we look at quantum. It's not a standalone technology. It's not going to replace classical computing, but it becomes a very important accelerator for some key applications. And that's really the theme, I think, of how we look at quantum. So let's just jump right into the market sizing activities. There have been a number of market projections in quantum, and they all graciously state some of their assumptions and such. And really, I just want to give a summary of some of the work that we've done recently. We just completed a market sizing effort. I want to say it was we presented it initially in December of 2021. And the key here was to go to the quantum computing suppliers around the world to gather their data and insights on quantum computing market dynamics to really give our most data-driven perspective of how the market's going to go. And really what we want to do there is thank organizations such as the U.S. Quantum Economic Development Consortium, a government body that is designed to be a pre-competitive organization to foster the ultimate state of health of quantum computing in the United States. And also we reached out to a number of counterpart organizations such as the Quantum Industry Council in the EU, who you'll be hearing about. I want to say later in the program. I think it may be tomorrow. The Quantum Industry Canada organization, as well as Austrade, and we use those organizations to reach out to members of quantum computing suppliers outside the United States in order to get a much better global perspective on the market. We ended up coming up with a 20-question survey once we had identified those commercial suppliers through the help of these organizations. And we ultimately got about 152 respondents to respond to this particular survey. Now, we did have some multiple responses from corporations, and we wanted to make sure that we didn't overcount organizations that were perhaps submitted 2 or 3 times. So we ended up weeding those multiple responses out, and we got about 112 distinct commercial organizations who were represented in the study. And this is the geographic distribution where the headquarters are located of the organizations that we spoke to. As you can see, unfortunately, or fortunately, we're a U.S.-based organization, so we had the greatest participation in North America, but we did touch a number of important players in Europe, as well as Asia Pacific and Middle East and Africa. We are holding this particular study is now an annual event. I'll get that in a minute, but this is our second annual study that we did, and so in sometime in October or November, we'll be sending out additional surveys to organizations. And please, if you are listening to the sound of my voice and want to be included in this study, we're going to do our best to reach out to you. But if you send us an invitation that says, please include us in this study, we would welcome you gladly. So let's just jump to some of the key findings of what came out of this particular study. And as I said, based on the survey responses from 112 quantum computing suppliers with that geographic distribution I just gave you, the estimated global quantum computing market in 2021 was worth about $490 million, which gives us an anticipated compound aggregate growth rate till about 2024 of about 21.9%, which brings us to about a $900 million market in 2024. Now, what was interesting is as we talked to some of these companies, we really wanted to get a sense of what their particular composition was. And one of the more interesting takeaways was that about half the companies we spoke to had revenues in 2021 of less than $500,000. And of those 49% of those companies, half of those had no revenues in 2021. And at the same time, we had about 7% of companies who had quantum computing revenues of more than $10 million. So in some sense, this is still a very nascent sector. There are an awful lot of companies out there right now who are living primarily off investment, whether it be through venture capital, corporate venturing, or government funding to permit their continued research and development of products, even though they have not yet entered the commercial sector. However, there are a number of companies out there who are making a go at it from a commercial perspective in terms of generating revenue. Not significant amounts of revenue yet, but certainly the idea here that there are some organizations, and you probably know who those usual suspects are, who are starting to actually generate legitimate revenue, which ultimately adds up to that near $500 million mark. We did find, as we heard just recently from the IQM talk, that the cloud access model is going to dominate for the next 3 years. When we asked these suppliers where they think their revenues will be coming from in terms of, say, access to quantum computing, 43% of the respondents said it's going to be an all cloud concept. Others, 21% said that it'll be hybrid, which means there'll be some on-prem capability, but some cloud access model as well, which means that about a third of them are anticipating a certain amount of on-prem market revenues coming in the next few years. And at first, that number struck me as high, but as I started talking to more and more end users, I began to realize that essentially many end users are really interested in kicking the tires on quantum computing in the cloud access model because of the low barrier to entry, the incremental cost model, and the fact that they can experiment with a number of different hardware and software platforms. But as it becomes more driven into their business process and becomes a critical element in, say, their R&D capability, their innovative capabilities, or their competitive advantage, we see more organizations bringing an on-prem capability in for confidentiality, protection of data, or simply because they're going to be driving those quantum systems hard enough and aggressively enough where the economics dictate an on-prem system can actually justify replacing it from a cloud access model. When we talked about most promising market segments, quantum computing right now is one of the largest computers of quantum computing technology, simply because so many organizations are experimenting with different hardware and software. But there was great enthusiasm in terms of sectors, including cybersecurity, the financial field, academia, and chemical and chemistry. But we found that of the 17 different commercial verticals that we generally monitor, which includes things like oil and gas and biosciences and automotive and aerospace, there is significant interest in many of these end users looking towards bringing quantum computing into their overall computational workload. This is just a quick summary of how the market looks, a nice graphic. As I said, this is the second year of the study, and the light blue bars on the left are what we predicted using data from 2019, and the dark blue bars on the right side of each year are the most recent estimate that we're discussing here. And as I said, as an annual event, we're going to be able to fill out this to hopefully build a little more credibility in the estimate and add some ground truth perhaps to how the market is actually growing. Well, when we asked some of these companies, these QC suppliers, about how they saw the revenue breakdown, this is just a simple graphic that shows in the next 36 months or so, hardware and software revenues will be near parity. And in the software field, that breaks down to applications will be about 21% of revenues, while the middleware, the idea of the software that supports the infrastructure to actually develop or execute or operate a quantum computing system, will be about 13%. I'm a little more optimistic about the professional support and service sector here, being perhaps larger in the near term. We all know that the quantum computing sector is one of scarcity of technical experts, and the idea that an organization that wants to bring quantum into their environment is going to have some significant problems integrating it through the hiring of quantum computing experts. There's just not enough of them to go around. The quantum computing suppliers are also facing the same kind of workload constraints. And so what I see is professional service organizations that can come in and bridge the gap between quantum computing suppliers and quantum computing end users to make the task of integrating that capability into an existing computational facility is one that I think is going to be increasingly important in the next few years, certainly because of some of the workforce scarcity issues. We just asked a little bit about how they saw revenues breaking out by algorithm, and I don't think anyone would be surprised by the fact that there's near equal enthusiasm for the traditional applications that quantum is shining at right now: machine learning, optimization, modeled sim. Some interesting interest now in cybersecurity has seemed to pop up, as well as Monte Carlo processes. Monte Carlo is a fundamental process in traditional mod sim on classical computers, and it depends very heavily on the ability to access really good random numbers. And the ability to have quantum generated random numbers is an important and I think growing activity that's really gathering a certain amount of interest and will continue to grow, specifically as it feeds into the overall HPC modeling and simulation environment. Now, this is just a quick snapshot, if you will, of the depth and breadth of what's going on out there in this sector. In my mind, the real vitality of what's going on. I like to remind our clients in the U.S., folks, this is not a U.S.-centric activity. There is no legacy here. There is no advantage towards being a leader in classical computer that translates into quantum, and this is a global phenomena. And all this is a quick summary, if you will, of just the commercial quantum computing hardware suppliers that I can identify. And I want to stress the worst of the used visible, because I know that there are at least a handful, if not more, of stealth players out there looking at quantum hardware as well. But the bottom line is I've been able to identify about 44 different hardware developers, and this is a little histogram of the distribution of those companies. And as you can see, there are many, many organizations around the world who have definite plans, have ongoing activities to field quantum computing hardware capability, either already or in the near future. And the other point of this is the variety of modalities that these organizations are looking at. You can see that superconducting qubits are still probably the main driver of quantum modality interest right now, but photonics has actually moved up in terms of interest and such, perhaps because of the ability to do quantum networking or quantum teleportation inside a quantum system to look at, say, a quantum multiprocessor architecture, trapped ion spins. The depth and breadth of different modalities out there is absolutely amazing, and there is no real clear winner yet. And what's fascinating to me, and there's a talk later on in this particular conference that compares some of the modalities, and this is probably the question I get most from our clients, which is which modality wins. And the answer to me is the dust really hasn't settled yet. There's a lot of interesting work that still needs to be done, but the two factors that I look at most when I judge the quality of a modality future potential is its ability to scale and its ability to deal with error correction. So I'll just leave it at that at this particular point in time. But the takeaway of this chart is global phenomena, lots of activity, lots of innovation going on. Now, that's all the good news. Now, the issue here, though, is quantum has moved in some sense away from being a pure technological phenomena to one that has raised a significant level of interest in the investment community as well. And that's really good. The numbers on the left, which I cribbed from other sources, talks about investors placing significant amount of money in quantum computing. Right now, as I said earlier, a lot of companies don't generate significant revenue, so they're dependent on the inflow of resource dollars. So we see on the left the number of companies that have received significant amounts of funding through primarily venture capital in many cases or government funding programs. And then we see the number of deals that are going on from the VC community are growing, and the absolute average size of these deals are growing. That's all great news. It's wonderful that the sector is moving that way, but now there's always a penalty to be paid whenever you start to attract attention within the investment community. And this little snippet on the right here that just came out about a week ago, a company called Scorpion Capital basically issued about a 150-page plus deck with the sole intent of upsetting and to some extent driving down the stock price of one of the few companies in the world that are listed on a major stock exchange in quantum computing, a company called IonQ. And what this company does, and it's right on their webpage, is they short the stock, then they release information that they believe investors should know about. So we've already started to see some impact of what's going on in the financial sector and how this plays in the quantum realm. So this is transitioning. The sector is moving from primarily a technology-driven phenomena to one that is starting to take on a more market-oriented perspective, and it carries with it a certain amount of pain and suffering that we're all going to have to go through before this market becomes a truly self-sustaining activity where R&D generates products, products generate sales, sales generate revenues, which support products. It's still in a somewhat vulnerable stage that we have to be aware of. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, I work right outside of Washington, D.C. I can't ignore policies. I'll tell you right now that the U.S. Congress is looking at already the idea of marketplace and supply chain vulnerabilities in the quantum computing field, and we see this as a growing trend around the world. Quantum computing has been identified by most of the major governments of the world as not only a potential large driver of economic competitiveness, but also as a national security agenda item. And we're starting to see activities and legislations and concerns already about vulnerabilities to domestic supply chain, what needs to be done to secure quantum computing supply chains. So again, this is now moving from technology to investment to national security policy initiatives. I've just recently completed a study for the Quantum Economic Development Consortium here in the U.S. to help respond to this particular congressional demand. And we're looking to make this an international phenomena to, again, as we do the market sizing activity, to reach out to organizations and commercial suppliers around the world to understand their perceptions on quantum computing supply chain vulnerabilities and what needs to be done at the government level to ensure that the technologies and materials and processes necessary to ensure the continued growth of this sector are made available and not arbitrarily divided up into different segments for national security agenda items. So I'll leave it at that. One of the things I did want to talk about is, as I looked at that supply chain issue, one of the interesting aspects of the congressional request had to do with the fact of what about the end user supply chain? Do we have the ability to understand exactly how we can keep markets open, how we can ensure that our government or other governments don't impede the market potential of these products or services once they are actually manufactured or become available to the sector. So we started reaching out to end users last year to really get their sense of what's going on from their perspective of how they see quantum coming into their particular world. And we saw the IQM study that IDC did this year, and this is, I won't say it's a companion study, but it was conducted about the same time, and I'm happy to say that our results are relatively within agreement. We ended up talking to about 415 different companies around the world who are quantum computing end users or are considering using quantum computing in, say, perhaps the next 3 years. And one of the things we did is we set a very arbitrary goal, which I just wanted to highlight. We wanted to make sure that the companies we spoke to had at least $50 million in revenue and an annual IT budget of $5 million. And the only reason we did that really was to make sure that we were talking to companies that perhaps had the financial wherewithal, be it from a revenue perspective or at least from an IT budget perspective, to really seriously kick the tires when it comes to thinking about quantum computing. So again, an arbitrary metric, but it was one that we think really fleshes out the kinds of companies or identifies the kinds of companies who are in a position to actually start to implement some form of quantum computing program in-house with the financial wherewithal to do it in a credible way. So as the IDC studies showed, and what our companion study also showed, is about 70% of the companies, of the 415 companies we surveyed worldwide, and this was truly a very good global study. We reached out to a lot of end users in the United States and the EU. We really managed to capture a lot of folks in Asia Pacific as well. About 70% of those had some form of in-house quantum computing program. And I'll get to what that definition of in-house is in a minute and what that quality of program is. But when we asked what the other 20% of those surveys said that they actually had plans to do so in the next few years. So if you do the simple math there, what that means is about 90% of the companies that we spoke to in this particular survey will have some form of quantum computing in-house program in the next, say, 2 to 3 years. And when we asked them about what they saw quantum technology doing for them from a business perspective, we saw a range of corporate level benefits being cited, improved research capabilities, increased revenue, driving innovation. Interestingly enough, things like lowering time to market and increasing lowering time to market and cutting costs were not nearly viewed as high. This was seen more as an ability to break out, to drive R&D and innovation, and maybe gain some competitive advantage in the process than it was to become more of a kind of a rank and file optimization of existing capabilities. It was more about growth potential in new areas. And so one of the things we saw was lots of looking at the optimization issue, we think, loomed very large. And I think that was just because that seems to be some low-hanging fruit in a lot of these corporations, the ability to take some existing processes and move them into an optimization, move them into a more optimized mode, seemed to be on the minds of a lot of executives in the short term. That's how they viewed some of the more near-term applications as some of the more aggressive R&D and innovation processes come online and take a few years to actually reach fruition. We talked to a number of verticals. I think again, our number was 17 here. And what we found is that there is significant numbers of organizations involved in some QC activity in every vertical we surveyed. It isn't as if things like the financial sector or the bioscience sector received the lion's share of interest in quantum. We saw it across every vertical that we did. And if you want to see the full-blown report on this, I can send it to you. Just drop me an email. I think it's about a 30 or 40 page document that really summarizes exactly which verticals were interested in, what technologies or what particular stage of quantum computing exploration they were involved in. One of the things we found is that most of the companies that were interested were already involved in things like data analysis, machine learning, deep learning, optimization, mod sim, research into new material sciences. We did target, to some extent, organizations that have some form of existing advanced computing infrastructure. So these are research-heavy organizations. We charted companies that had HPC-based R&D, HPC-based production capability, or were traditional IT shops that had some form of advanced computing, primarily in the areas right now of, say, deep learning or machine learning. They're dipping their toe in the AI space. But we found that most of them are already doing some of the applications that are already identified as key in the quantum computing space. So many of these organizations are very ripe already. They have unmet computational demand. Their classical architectures are becoming more expensive. We heard that earlier. I read an article this morning that showed that one of the new Department of Energy systems that the U.S. is standing up right now, it'll take about 6 months or more to install at Argonne National Lab, could be one of the fastest HPCs in the world, at a $600 million price tag. For a lot of organizations, that's an unsustainable goal in terms of price. So what we see are organizations that have a significant amount of unmet computational capability that would more than welcome the price performance advantage of an alternate technology like quantum computing to address some of their existing shortfalls in workload capability.